Buenos dias, o buenas tardes. I'm Patrick Velasquez, a co-chair of the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio on Higher Education. On today's program, we'll discuss issues for Chicano students in California's community college, or colleges, I should say, and we're pleased to have with us today Maria Figueroa, who is a professor of English Literature and Humanities at Mira Costa College in North County, San Diego. So, gracias María y bienvenida.
Gracias, Patrick. Good to see you and good to be here. Gracias por la invitación.
Mi placer. María,
Ujú.
would you start by telling us a little bit about your background and your current role as an educator?
Yes, thank you. Pues primeramente, I want to say good morning, buenas tardes, and acknowledge that I am here in North County, San Diego via Zoom, the original homelands of our Kumeyaay relatives near the coastlands and coastal waters. With that, also acknowledging that I'm in the territory, I guess you could say, of my father's transfronterizo, experience and identity. He's from Tijuana, and the borderlands of Juarez for my mother, which takes me to Santana, which is where I was born and raised. Born and raised in the 714, which is a really old area code that no one gets anymore. For the first 17 years of my life, that's where my grandmother, my great grandmother, my family landed basically in the Orange County, Santana, La Habra area, and went through public school there. My parents are first generation. I'm working class, and went through public school in K through 12 in the public schools of Santana, which I reflect on often, I think, as we get older, and just kind of curious what that was like, and realized that while there was a lot of community and very beautiful experiences, like the story of many of our Black and brown and Asian families, that we experience a lot of the microaggressions, macroaggressions, the systemic racism, right? But with the support and love and, I think, intervention of the community and my parents, who always had, the best interest in mind for me as an eldest daughter of three children. And perhaps they didn't know exactly what college entailed, but they always said, vas a ir a la escuela, and that basically translated to always do good in school, stay on a good path, so to speak, and we'll support you however we can. And so when the outreach programs, that were really impactful in, I would say, the early 90s, there was a lot of outreach done at my high school. And I think in the local high school, again, because we were all from like immigrante first gen families. And so I ended up coming to UC San Diego, which is how I ended up in San Diego after all these years, to study teatro. Because I was a little thespian at the time. I really enjoyed the arts and have always enjoyed performance and writing and music and art. And I knew of a very important Chicano theater historian at UC San Diego, who some of the people who I was doing theater with in Santana knew. And so I came to UC San Diego to study with Dr. Jorge Huerta, who, Patrick, and then I met you, Patrick, in the parking lot of Revelle College, and I think my parents met you too. And I always attribute their ease in dropping me off at Summer Bridge in 1993, kind of like a warm handoff, as we say, to an academic tío.
Mhm.
And I remember you were there. I think Teresa Melendres was there too, and so all these people remain very vivid in my mind as a welcoming bienvenida to UCSD. So did my 4 years there with majoring in theater, minoring in ethnic studies and Spanish literature, two disciplines that I found to also speak to my identity, and that early identity formation of empowerment as a thinker, scholar, artist, and Chicana in my conscientización building, very much through your own tutelage, Patrick, when you were teaching us in Summer Bridge, and then later on in the other courses that I was taking throughout the 4 years, just really solidified, I think, my journey and my identity as a thinker, as a scholar activist, as an artivist, back in the day. And then I ended up going to Dartmouth College. And that for me was really, I think, transformative as well. How does this Southern California working class Mexicanita Chicana end up in the New England, in the Northeast, which is really, I think, unheard of. But I think it happened because I had people, mentors and academic guides who were like, you need to go, and we will support you, we will help you. And this is what you need to do, right? So that mentorship, that those guías and validating agents, were really instrumental in ensuring that I continued on a particular, academic path.
And
So
that's
yeah.
an Ivy League institution.
Yes, it is. It's an Ivy League. I knew Dr. Diana Taylor, who was a colleague of Dr. Huerta. She's now, I think, in performance studies at NYU. Very well known, scholar in performance studies. And she essentially like told Jorge, you need to send me some students. And I had worked with her actually a winter prior to, I think, the year that I applied. And I worked with her on a performance out there. I went during a winter to, Northeast, and quite a culture shock, but good thing I went then so that I knew what I was getting into a year and a half later. So yes, and then I came back to California because California's home, and I wanted to be of service and in service in my community. So I actually returned to Santana. I tried to do some emergency credential teaching, during that time in the, I think, mid to late 90s. There was a shortage, I want to say, of public school teachers. And so I thought, this is my time, to come back to the community. Things didn't really work out well in that sense. Uh, and I returned to San Diego because this is where I had like social, cultural, and political, I would say, roots, right? Because it was sort of the foundation. I had established that early in the 90s. Um, and so I returned to San Diego, started making my connections again, the network, and I started teaching at City College as a part-timer. At San Diego State, I taught writing communication in the Chicano Studies program. I taught a world theater class at CSU San Marcos. I taught a critical thinking class at Mesa. So I had sort of that adjunct experience and identity in teaching, the four corners of San Diego County, which was good for me, and to understand sort of the diversity of learners and just experiences in the different systems, right, intersegmentally in San Diego. So that's a little bit of my own background, but I've been an educator for 25 years in the community college system. So when I hear myself saying in the 90s, I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm really that Gen Xer, right? A little bit older, but when I first started, I wasn't that much older than my students. I always like to tell a story that I had back then. I had an abuelita in my class. She was like in her 60s, and I would say she was probably like a regular grandmother, right? But she was in a critical thinking class, and I loved her. And she remained so imprinted in my heart and my mind. And she would call me mija, she'd say, mija, that was hard. That was a hard assignment, But those types of, I think, experiences in the community college teaching and learning context are just are really important and humanizing and humbling, right? Humbling and remind us as to why we are teaching, what we're teaching, and with whom in the community. I started my tenure, track experience. And really, I grew up professionally. I would say I matured professionally at San Diego City College, which is where I started my tenure. I was there 9 years as a full-time instructor in the English department. I also taught in Chicano and Chicano studies. I taught literature and I taught culture. Um, and then I ended up applying to another position at Mira Costa and have been tenured at Mira Costa since 2008. So I've been there now 17 years, I think. I'm coming up on 17 years in English, also teaching composition, literature, and humanities. So, it's been a journey. It's been a journey. And while at Mira Costa, I've served in various positions as academic senate president for 4 years. Two of those years were in the pandemic, which was really, really difficult. Was a department chair for another 4 years. Our department's really large. We're letters, and so we have 5 different disciplines, and everything that comes, with that responsibility and role, and have chaired other academic senate subcommittees as well as district committees. So I've got a little bit of that quasi-administrative, experience under my belt, but it's expected, I think, when you've been sort of in the I don't know, in the community college system for a long time. But I would say that one of the most important and I would say valuable roles is serving as a Puente English professor as well and co-coordinator of a flagship program in the state of California for many years as well. So, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So that's the intro.
Wow, grandes recuerdos, ¿no?
Sí. Tengo muchos más. I have many more, but maybe that's part two.
Well, I'm happy to see the Centro Cultural de la Raza in your background there. I
Mhm.
wanted you to talk a little bit about that before we jump into the community college issue. So I know that you serve on the board of directors of the Centro, and could you talk a little bit, Maria, about the kind of programming that the Centro is providing now, and maybe touch a little bit on a very important recent exhibition at the Centro?
Absolutely. Yes, so this is the historic Centro Cultural de la Raza. We are in Balboa Park, as many of your viewers or our viewers here will know, and if not, well, now you know. We are a 54-year-old organization. Originally, this wasn't we're in a water tank, right? And that's not the original space that was occupied, but where the city finally said, okay, this is where you'll be. And since then, this has been our home. We're right across the lawn, which we're hoping to make a future cultural plaza across from the World Beat Center. So we are a sister organization. But as in my role at the Centro currently, I'm the vice president of the board. And so our board is very healthy right now in terms of its a representation. Most of us are educators, but some of us are also longtime community members and just interested community folks who want to do good for the Centro. Um, the Centro has gone through several iterations of leadership. And since the late Harry Baza, we've kind of had our ebbs and flows of executive director leadership. But since I want to say more than 13 years ago, we've primarily been a volunteer-based run organization. So the boards have kept the doors open, right? But within the last 10 years, there's been a transition into a more robust, I would say, programming, of the Centro. And that was very much made possible with developing some infrastructure that we didn't have prior to, the new board onboarding, if you will. So that took a lot of work, a lot of grassroots organizing, a lot of community repair and rebuilding. And since then, our infrastructure is such that we have an arts advisory committee that really ensures that the programming is ongoing and that it's ongoing based on what the community needs and what the community desires. Our process is such that the community comes to these arts advisory committee meetings and proposes a particular event or series of programs, and they are welcomed to present and imagine, so long as I think the proposal is aligned with our mission, our historic mission and our values. And I would say, 90% of those proposals come through and the community puts on, their event, and we provide the space and we provide the support. And so this is, when you look at our social media page, like we have events going on every single day, every single weekend. We have some pillar events, which are like Dia de los Muertos, which is something that we do annually. We have a posada in December. Enero Zapatista tends to be a signature event as well during Enero. And the Women's Month, International Women's Day, we also have an event that is a signature event. So aside from everything else, whether it's a community member or a group, again, that is interested in supporting our mission and vision, and then they want to align themselves with the program, we welcome their participation. Um, and we were fortunate enough to receive a Mellon grant. So the Mellon Foundation has been doing some really good work. I think they've taken inventory in sort of reflecting on what's important for them to support as an organization. And so several years ago, they came to us. They came to several San Diego historic organizations to kind of have these listening circles, these pláticas, and figure out like what was important to our community in this region, and they were in the borderlands. They were in Arizona, and they came here to San Diego, and essentially worked with us, and we seized that opportunity to apply for this grant that would allow us to do again more infrastructure, right, building. And so as a result, and then also create programming that was supportive and that supports our vision and our mission, and that returns, I think, to some of the original programming that the Centro has had around like performing arts and the visual arts and talleres, given our kind of multi-artistic, our multidisciplinary artistic expression at the Centro. So the Mellon gave us $500,000. And with that, we were able to hire some staff. So since 13, maybe 15 years ago, we have a staff of 3. That's big for us. We have an executive director, Ana Hernandez. We have an operations manager, and that is Carla Reyes. And we have an events coordinator, and that is Vita Orilivieli. And I wanted to mention their names, because they really do just a lot of the hard labor to keep the doors open, to coordinate all our volunteers. We have many volunteers. And to remind us that this is, a community space, that this is a healing space. This is a space where everyone and anyone can come to experience what Chicano, Mexicano, indigenous, culture is about, right? So since then, I mean, we have different projects aside from the programming that happens. We also have a garden. So there's a garden committee, and if you visit the Centro, you'll see that on the outskirts, they have actually built a garden, And we try to, keep it up with like the seasonal plantas, and just kind of spread out so that we can recycle, we can do compost. It's a teaching garden, it's a native garden. It's really beautiful, really, really beautiful. And the space, I would say, is transformed. So I'm in love with the space. I go there often. I don't live close, but might as well, and then supporting the resident groups that we have there, which are Danza Azteca. I think we have a tango group. We have a Native American church group that practices there too and gathers there. We have two different dance groups, an older Señora Zapateado kind of group, and then we have Mujeres en Resistencia. So we're busy. I mean, the doors are open to the public 12 to 5, but on the off hours, there's other groups that are using the space again to cultivate sort of their artistic expression and what we need to keep our tradiciones, right, and our cultura going. So that's the centro right now. So along with this Mellon grant that we received, in addition to building staff, we we also received a grant to curate 4 different exhibits within a Borderlands Vision exhibit. So we just closed the second exhibit of the 4, and this is like for a whole year, right? This will take us for a whole year. And the last one, which I was a co-curator of, along with Dr. Susie Cepeda, who's a professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies at UC Davis. We co-curated Indigenous Borderlands, Weaving Nepantla, Remembering Sacred Relations. And we had a total of about maybe 20 artists that participated, that represented the Borderlands. And really what we envisioned, is this notion of I mean, the reality is that the border is a man-made, person-made, dividing line that is violent, that is unnatural, and it's hurtful and it's deadly. That those are the realities. And so we wanted to address that, in the exhibit, but in a way that also allowed us to remember the sacred relation of the land, on which we are living and breathing and loving, and creating a community and culture, and traditions, and return to that, return to it in a way through the visual storytelling, and return to that reality, because everything else that works, and not to negate like the violence, because that in and of itself is also an important, I think, thing to address, right, and to also remember, but that it wasn't like that, and that it doesn't need to be that way, right? So the artists that participated in this exhibit, I think, reminded us of that, right? Of the original kind of sacred relation that we have with the land, but also what happens when we disrespect and when we impose, I think, these foreign kind of colonial structures and colonial practices and rhetoric around who belongs and who doesn't, right? And what justifies that awful political person-made border. So Indigenous Borderlands is worked with that concept and reality. It's not conceptual, it's very real, right? For us, I think, that identify as indigenous people, and people of, who have either direct ties to the land that we're on, or have, the lineage, right, prior to there being sort of this hard dividing line. Um, so I'm really proud of the work that we did. It got many, I think, people came through. We had very successful opening and closing receptions, where the artists were able to tell their story, also not just through the exhibit of their work, but in a panel. And we had students come through, and we gave various uh, tours. Ideally I wanted to create some curriculum, because I'm a teacher and I'm always thinking, oh, how can we use this to, to teach, right? But I couldn't do that as well as curate the show. But it was a great experience. First time that I've really curated something on that scale. But I was very happy to do so with, like I said, my co-curator and comadre, Dr. Susie Cepeda. We had some great pieces in there and some really important, I think, artists. We had Celia Herrera Rodriguez, who is an installation artist, a watercolorist, and a co-founder and director of Las Maestras Center from UC Santa Barbara. And we also had Gina Paricio, who works with who creates these amazing larger than life clay sculptures, these nahuales. So we had, again, like I said, some really, really important, I think, artists, but not just because of their quote notoriety, but I think in the story and the way in which they were able to convey like the theme and the focus of that particular exhibit. So and we have two more exhibits as part of the Borderlands vision, again, that are supported by the Mellon.
Maria,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing all that.
Mm.
Well, talking about community colleges, there's so many issues, so many deep issues that we could spend a lot of time talking about. I wanted to start with the fact that you've been recently appointed to a statewide position with the
Mhm.
Puente program. And for those who may not be familiar with Puente, it's a very well recognized, validated, effective model program in community colleges in California that focuses on Chicano students. So I wanted to ask you, Maria, to talk a little bit about Puente. What are some of the elements of Puente that make it effective?
Mhm.
But also what you're doing with the program and some of the challenges the program might face in the future.
Yeah. So big question. I want to say that I have so much love for Puente. I think first I think it's important to acknowledge that, right? Because one thing to say it's like a historic flagship program and it does all the right things. But again, as a practitioner, as someone who's been in, the field for so long, I have a lot of love and appreciation for it because it really helped me, I think, as a younger English professor, Chicana, bilingual, code switcher, toda la cosa, right? Um, feel validated too, and feel seen and supported and encouraged. And I would say it healed me. It healed me in so many ways. Uh, and let me tell you why, right? So probably through sort of these examples, but as we know, in 1981, this program was founded at Chabot College to kind of address, I think, the issues of the pipeline. Like, why weren't Chicano, Latino, Mexican American students persisting and successfully transferring to four-year universities, And so this English professor and counselor got together and they sort of figured it out that it was a combination of things, that it wasn't like one sole professor or discipline's responsibility, but it was like a combination of things that was clogging the pipeline for these students to get through, or that was just pushing them out. And so they worked on, well, what do they need? They need good English, quote, good English, strong English composition skills, right? Writing, critical thinking, and then also personal development, counseling and career exploration. So those are the two kind of disciplines within the community college system that are entangled in the Puente model. But then there was this third element of connecting them to the community and mentoring, so that our students, being first generation Raza students, again, very much like myself, probably very much like you, Patrick, and I would say the majority of our California community college, students of color, like, who are the mentors in our lives that have carreras, that have, higher education experience. Not many, not many, if at all. So the mentorship component was added as this kind of trifecta of in the model that would enhance or and support the students, successful experience through the California community college system and persist through the pipeline into four-year institutions. And that proved to be successful, that proved to be successful because 41 years later, or maybe more than that, I think 1981, 40 some years later, we still have that model, right? We still have that model. So in the operationally, like, you have to have an English instructor that's a coordinator and a counselor, and both of them work together, work in tandem to coordinate this program. And they truly are and should share in the responsibility equally in ensuring that the program is functioning. It's a cohort model, so you have the same 25 to 30 students, depending on the cap, that are with you in your English class. So like I would have the same, 25, 30 students in the phase 1 for fall and in the phase 2, which is spring, the critical thinking core class. So we really imagine it as like a year-long writing experience. And that gives us a little bit more time, right, to maybe address some of the challenges that our students might be facing. And when we know that we are inheriting students that are coming from a K through 12 system that oftentimes is invalidating, is kind of will murder your spirit, and can tell you, your writing's bad, your stories aren't important, don't think about going to college. I mean, it's 2024, and we still hear these stories from our students, that they just don't have these validating agents in their lives, or very few. And so we take that year to just really high touch, intrusive, counseling practices. We bring in the families as well with our different events like Noche de Familia, a Bienvenida, to also educate the families, that these students are with when they're not with us in the classroom. And very much like, I think my parents, who knew that school was important and que ibas a ir a la escuela, they just didn't know like what that meant, right? And so it's also very much about, I think, educating the families or caretakers that are in these students' lives, so that they in turn have that apoyo, have that support outside of the academic, experience. So operationally, we have those two professor instructors that are coordinating the program. But before, I think culturally relevant, affirming and sustaining pedagogies were sort of the thing of diversity, equity, and inclusion today. Puente has been, I think, at the forefront of that since, its founding, with including, literature, writing, that is reflective of the students' experiences. So while we are open to all students, our literature still emphasizes Chicano, Latino, Latinx's experiences. And we really, like, I think, affirm, right, the majority of our students who come into our classrooms in the Puente program. And I would say that many of the students that I have taught in all of these years, which is probably in the thousands now, they will still say, like, this is the first time I've read a book where the experience sort of reflects my own, or this is the first time I've read a novel from cover to cover, from cover to cover, because everything else that they read, there were either no novels, right? Or the teacher just like didn't expose them to any like culturally, like I said, culturally relevant and affirming literature. And that in and of itself, I think, is devastating, because there's so much more now. There's so much more now. Maybe 40 years ago, not as, but so much more now. So our in Puente, we have we have a lens called pedagogy of cariño, and I think the cariño in and of itself is also important. It's not even like love. Like you can't even translate it to love, but when you are cariñoso, you really kind of approach your students. I guess you could say pedagogy of love too, right? That you approach them in such a way that you recognize who they are, right? And that's using Dr. Rendon's validation theory, that you validate their experiences, that they come with particular knowledge and strength from the home that is also good and important, and that you come from more strength space, right? Rather than deficit. And to quote some of our other scholars and thinkers, like their frameworks, like all the capitals, like what Dr. Yoso reminds us of, like our community cultural wealth model, that our students speak Spanish, or that they're bilingual, or that they're throwing in pochismos, that in and of itself is linguistic capital. And it's also very, it's valuable, right? Not in this like monetary way, but in this way of like understanding what our cultura has to offer. So approaching, I think, our pedagogy from this place of cariño is really, really important. And then finally, like I said, that third component of connecting our students to the community, to leaders in the community, to role models, is really critical too, because then they can see themselves and expand their own network and return to the community as leaders, and also as mentors. So while the students are on this learning journey, to persist and effectively transfer, and our data is public. All of our data shows that our students transfer successfully, faster than any other, community college student that doesn't go through a program such as Puente. And there are other programs, I think, that have also aligned with our practices. I think about like Umoja, who's our sister program in the community college system. I think about, like, we have MANA, which is the equivalent to Pacific Islander students, but I think there's others like for Asian American students too. So, I think that there are many folks who are learning, right, from the flagship program of Puente in and of itself, because it has proven to be successful, not only to meet sort of these metrics of transfer and success, but I think one of the most successful, less quantifiable experiences is that our students feel validated, our students feel humanized, our students feel like they can be who they are, right? In a very powerful, agency producing way. And that is like 100% central, I think, to ensuring that our students stay through, right? Their academic experience.
Thank you, Maria. It's interesting to hear you talk about the pedagogy de cariño.
Mhm.
In my travels through Cuba and my research on Cuba's educational system, their scholars talk about Cuba's pedagogy de ternura, or pedagogy of tenderness. And
Oh,
so it has a lot of the same implications, I think. Maria, there's so many things we could talk about again and probably just scratch the surface about
yeah.
community colleges. As you know, our San Diego Concilio has always insisted that
Mhm.
our state legislature, our elected officials, hold accountable our public institutions of higher education.
Mhm.
And I know that in recent years, the state legislature in California, it has mandated some changes in state community college policies that are meant to, I believe they're meant to increase transfer rates from community colleges to a four-year university, which is always an issue for us. So what are some of the changes in California community colleges that are related to ethnic studies or developmental courses and transfer pathways? I know it's a lot, and perhaps we can, again, scratch the surface today.
Yeah, we will only scratch the surface. And I feel like I have to preface all my comments as like, what hat am I wearing, right? But I'll say that I'm wearing the hat of both, um, well, yeah, primarily as an English faculty member, as a faculty member, right, that has particular investment in academic, freedom, autonomy, whatnot, disciplinary autonomy, but I also understand that systems, right? Systems are, and the systems, some of the systems in place maintain particular um, social and racial hierarchies that are unjust, right? And so you being a scholar of education know this like in and out. And we have lots of scholars that remind us of systemic racism and systemic white supremacy and how that plays out in the experiences of our students, and to the detriment, I think, of our first gen, like historically racialized and minoritized, communities, our Black and Brown, multilingual communities, impoverished community, all of that, right? In our intersecting identities. So I would say that sometimes legislation is important and is necessary. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. And this is where I think the faculty, the admins, the programs that interface, and the disciplines that interface with the legislation get really sensitive around these things. So let's talk about like AB 1705, which the precursor to that was AB 705, which really took to task like the pre-transfer experiences, the pre-transfer courses and programs in place for math and English. In some institutions, for example, before you got to English like 100, the freshman or fresh person composition course, right? The very first class that any college student, college level student takes, you had to take like 4 pre-transfer courses or developmental, they were called remedial courses, right? So 4 of them. Now that could be 2 years before you're even, 4 semesters before you're even like at the freshman composition level. And again, the literature supports, right, that the longer a student is in college, right, and the more layers there are, like the less they will be persistent and successful. So it's almost like this push out, right, or this stop. Um, and so I think that AB 705 and then later 1705, which sort of accelerated 705, said you colleges really need to look at that. And the throughput data showed that that students, that when you eliminate, right, the layers of the gatekeeping, I guess you could say, right, layers of pre-transfer or historical remediation classes, and you get students into English 100, and you support them with like supplemental instruction or learning center, writing consultants and all of that, then they persist and they do best, right? Will there be some failures? Absolutely, that's always going to happen, but your number of students will increase. That was a major systemic, I think, shakeup for English and math. And I think the English folks are kind of getting it. There's been some kicking and screaming still, but I think with English, it is skill-based, but we've been able to mitigate some of those challenges, with like supplemental instruction or adding some course number, more units, for example, to support our students. But 1705 doesn't allow us to add more units anymore, because that's also something that AB 928, which is the CalGETC and student transfer achievement reform, which lessens the number of eligible transfer units, will impact, I think, our traditional, let's say, English courses. The math discipline, I'm not a math instructor, so I don't want to speak, but I think they're having more challenges because it implicates, like, I think, transfer for STEM, like STEM pathways and calculus, and then the other algebra, I want to say, but don't quote me on that. I would say ask the math teachers, but I know that they're struggling. Their discipline is definitely struggling. So AB 1705 is in effect. It's a law. I think administrators are pretty much like you with their support and with professional learning, professional development, like we just need to step up to the challenge. I can't put it any other way. But when I think about like my Puente experience as an English professor, I feel like Puente has been doing that because it's so high touch, right? Um, high touch in every way, like intrusive, counseling and high touch, high standards, high support in English instruction. Like we've been doing that type of pedagogy already. So I think our disciplines can learn very much from, again, what Puente has been doing. So I mentioned AB 928, which is the CalGETC Student Transfer Achievement Reform bill, AB 928. And that one reduces the number of transferable units. This also impacts financial aid, right? And so because community college is open access, open to everyone, our students enroll, right? But the student who's like a lifelong learner is no longer like that identity quote of the lifelong learner is no longer almost no longer like a parent or even valid, if you will, right? Because you won't get any financial aid, right, for it. Because like, let's say you just want to come back and take some classes and you apply for financial aid, like you can't unless you're on a transfer, academic transfer degree. And that I think is a philosophical debate too. It's like, how do we what's community college then, right? Who's the community that we're talking about? But I understand why CalGETC is in place because again, many of our first gen students, they explore, right? They try to figure it out. If there's no like prior guidance and model and mentor saying you need to take this. For example, I'm not first gen anymore. My kids are second gen college. They have me as like their counselor, right? That says, let's take a look. What is, on plan A, plan B, where do you want to transfer? I'm going to make sure they're going to be on that track, right? If they're pursuing higher ed, four-year institutions. But someone like myself, my parents didn't have that. I needed that careful guidance. So had I not had sort of that careful guidance, I probably would have explored many things and it takes longer. And then you have less units that financial aid will cover, right? And the longer you are in community college, again, the less persistent you become and successfully transfer to the 4 years. So the legislation attempts to mitigate, I think, that early on. So we've gone from like 60 possible units to I think like 34. It's a real kind of drastic reduction. And that impacts disciplines as well, because there's now in intersegmentally, right? From community college to CSUs and UCs, there's particular courses and disciplines that are not required anymore, right, for transfer and for graduation attainment. So I think disciplines like history are being impacted, right? And I don't want to say they're being replaced, but there are now other areas in the education plans that are required for let's say graduation at the CSU, and that is the ethnic studies requirement. So when we think of AB 1460, which was proposed by Dr. Shirley Weber, I think former chair and professor of Africana Studies at SDSU, she's now the secretary, right? Secretary of State, I think, right, in California. From her leadership and in the um, successful implementation of AB 1460, that students who are in CSU are now required to complete an ethnic studies class for graduation. And many of our students are doing that at the community college level, right? So because we're offering lower division. So that has helped our community college in abundance by now formally, I think, recognizing, and rightfully so, ethnic studies as an independent discipline and as a necessary I think, discipline of study. And then within its other, like other disciplines, like Black studies, Africana studies, Chicano studies, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native American studies, Indigenous studies. I think that's very important in its validation, right? That these disciplines and areas of study are important, and that all students, like English 100, should be taking this, right? So it's now required general education. And again, there's a lot of I think disciplinary battles, philosophical battles around, well, what's more important. But I think that's part of like that systemic control, right? That's part of that systemic limitation, that we need to work with what we have, and legislation is sometimes what you have in place to impact systemic overhaul or systemic change. And that's going to disrupt status quo. It's going to disrupt what we're accustomed to, right? And really kind of intervene in ways that are hopefully, I would say, beneficial. Do I think that general ed, um, do I think that remediation and developmental courses needed um, reform? Absolutely. Absolutely, right? Do I think that more students should be taking ethnic studies? Absolutely. Of course, I have an ethnic studies background too, right? So all of these things are critical, and I mean, we just kind of have to keep our eyes on the prize and hope that, the students who come through our community college system and then, transfer to CSUs and or to the UCs, that they are just better human beings, like that they have an awareness. We're becoming a much more inter interconnected, I mean, communities, and we need to be open, I think, to exploring who our neighbors are. And I don't mean to sound cliche, but like who we are as well. We have a right. We're entitled to also, study um, our own legacies and our own, rich histories and and political, interventions and whatnot. So I'm kind of getting on a little bit of a soapbox there, but again, it's not perfect, but the growing pains are happening. And I happen to be, I think, in this crossroads of like, I know kind of the big picture legislation, and not at the grassroots level as a faculty member that's been involved in these statewide conversations.
Mm.
Like, it's also informed me at a local level in terms of how to intervene at my own college to create, I think, to create an ethnic studies program. Like, I was very instrumental with a group of faculty to ensure that we implemented an ethnic studies department in its fidelity, in the way that it should be, rather than it being, I'm going to say, appropriated and co-opted by another discipline that is not ethnic studies, or other disciplines, right? That are not ethnic studies. So there's a lot of debate about that, but that's also very much within the confines of what our community college system recognizes as discipline, because we have like minimum qualifications and all that. CSUs and UCs, it's a whole other story. And the UCs are kind of always on their own, we're always at the
Very much.
mercy of sort of what they dictate. And this, having worked at UCSD, but I'm hopeful, and maybe I'm naive, but I'm hopeful that at some point they're going to also see that they should require, ethnic studies, for example, as a graduation requirement. They
Yeah,
should.
it's long overdue, and I
Mhm.
really appreciate your last comments. I'm also very heartened by the CSU requirement for ethnic studies. It's extremely important, and again,
Mhm.
if anything, late. And I think that is a positive sign. I just returned from a trip to the Midwest where I was born and raised, and I'm listening to the political commercials on TV there. And if you didn't know better, you would think that this is like Omaha, Nebraska. You would think they were right on the border because there were so many commercials about this supposed border crisis.
Oh,
And I
gee.
come back to San Diego, and there's really a different attitude here. And maybe I need to reflect more on that. But I think
Mhm.
more people here are recognizing San Diego as a binational region. And the way
Mhm.
that you talked about the border at the beginning of our program, I think is is a very profound statement about that. And again, the somewhat increased validation of ethnic studies is maybe a reflection of that. And I
Mhm,
share your optimism. I'm hoping that our state elected officials will continue to hold institutions accountable. So,
mhm.
Maria, that was very informative. I really appreciate all your reflections and all the information today.
Of
And I
course.
think we'll probably have to do a part two at some point.
Let's do it.
All right. So, muchas gracias, María, y gracias a todos ustedes por escucharnos. Hasta la próxima.
Gracias, Patrick.